Poems emphasize language's musical qualities.
Did you ever take and try to give an ironclad leave to yourself from a 3-rail billiard shot?
Poems often feature intense feelings.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up.
This can be achieved through rhyme, rhythm, and meter.
Started with a technical difficulty.
Some sort of delay.
Somebody's iPod track wouldn't play.
From the sonnets of Shakespeare to the odes of Confucius.
Ali fights great. He's got speed and endurance. If you sign to fight him, increase your insurance.
While the rhythmic patterns of the earliest poems were a way to remember stories even before the advent of writing, a poem doesn't need to be lyrical.
I hate us corny with that Illuminati mess. Paparazzi catch my fly and my cocky fresh.
Wrote poems whose shapes were as important as the words themselves. In this case, amplifying the sad loneliness of a single leaf, falling, 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 falling.
Poetry is... No, that's not what it was.
I once read a poem that urged me to let things go, so I did.
A team of horses will thresh 300 bushels a day, and even one horse with a $25 machine can be good business.
My faith is not the ripping kind, but a mirror fragment shattered. My bones are not the breaking kind, but a wind-gnarled tree underneath the flesh.
All its cards are drawn blank. The magic is but a rule. Keep watching.
It kind of depends. There are times where I'll just like get a phrase in my head, or I'll like know that I really need to write about something, and I'll just sit down and it'll just flow out.
And then editing over many versions, reworking things in many different directions and possibilities. It was very sort of like, in a way, like, given that, you know, quickly this became like a computer-based interface and to some extent.
Get up in the morning and say, absolutely, I'm gonna sit down and write for a certain amount of time. Make sure you can't get online. Like all the distractions. Like I think half of writing is avoiding writing, which you guys probably know as English majors. It doesn't really change.
I usually write every time I get really angry, and I have a temper, so I usually have to channel my anger into words, and that's my poetry. I have so many poems because I'm angry often.
But there are other times where, like, if I'm kind of stuck, or if I have like a specific prompt for a class that just like doesn't really click with me, I'll like read like books of poetry, or I'll like read back on my old stuff, or I'll just like sit there and like force myself to just like start typing words that I hate until eventually like I get to a place where I'm like, oh, okay, like I figured out what I need to be saying.
So a lot of drafts, and would just continually be producing words on the page. Lots and lots and lots. And
whenever I get really passionate or really angry about something, that's when the poetry is easier for me to write. And that's when I feel like I have my strongest poetry, because there's a little bit more heart in it than it would if I was just writing poetry anyway. So that's why I have so much poetry on my phone, because like I get angry in the moment and then I'll write it on my phone.
It's always like about generating some sort of, basically finding material. Yeah. You know, the kind of like treating words like objects. Like I have to have paint. If I were a painter, you need paint. And so then once I'm playing around with the words as objects, it starts to end up being like a Ouija board or something, because I'm not thinking about what I'm thinking about. You know, I'm not like saying like, oh, I want to write about my emotional life or something, or what I'm upset about, but it ends up coming through in these kind of oblique ways. Yeah, and so in that sense, at the end, it's like, oh, this was what I was thinking about.
like was a practice in which the manipulation and experimentation with text was very central for a long time.
But basically, if I feel passionate or angry enough about a certain topic, then I'll write about it, and then I'll continue to write about it until I'm done, and then that's how it goes. But I only ever write poetry, I've noticed, when I'm pissed off about something.
Yeah. I guess it's because of the fear of not being able to do it. It's a kind of ridiculous fear, because every time I sit down and actually write, something happens. But there's always this fear that, like, what if I sit down and nothing happens?
Well, I feel like there's a difference between quotes and poetry. I think if you want to do the whole Twitter quote thing, that's what it is. It's just a quote.
You know, I've talked to a lot of poets who are particularly explicit about not being invested in the book as a form.
There's stuff that I know that frustrates me with poetry, or what I see Twitter doing to poetry, or social media doing to poetry, is that in the same way that a rock star or a musician or some other, or I don't know, some movie star would want to gain followers, what you're really selling is your personality. So there's some poets who use social media really well and they get really popular, but it's not because of their poetry, it's because of their personality on social media. And that just seems kind of gross to me.
So I think that poetry has kind of like an elitist connotation a lot of times. So I think that in that sense, it's important to have like Twitter poems, just kind of like make it more accessible and like acknowledge how like important it is to be a part of like the digital media realm in order to really like reach a wider audience.
So I mean, the whole one-line poetry is great if it's like bringing more people to the poetry scene, but I don't want them to think that that's what poetry is.
Yeah.
I mean, it's more than that. You can like expand and do whatever you want with poetry, not just make it one line and then move on.
Your names and like a picture of a dog as the avatar that are tweeting, and I think that adds a weird element of like distance of the poet, you know, like who's writing this, what is, and like that's an interesting dialogue of just what do you do whenever you don't have a poet to place as the author of something.
But it makes sense to me that it would be contemporary poetry that would feel an ability to move across different mediums and not be compromised in certain ways.
But I find it hard to tweet about myself. Like if I do an interview, I tweet it, but I can't be like, I don't know, there's these people who are saying, I'm incredibly humbled to have had this review, blah, blah, blah. It's like, you're not humbled, you're excited. And there's this kind of performance of self-promotion for poetry that gets me really grossed out.
I feel like when you use poetry, you're using the whole thing as a way to give out a deeper message or a bigger message other than one line.
I wouldn't say that those poems hold as much weight, just because I feel like I usually see ones that are like funny, and that's awesome, but they don't like resonate with me as much as like if I read a book of poetry that's dealing with like deeper themes.
But I don't idealize the physical book as warranting more attention than something that appears on the internet, per se.
I grew up Catholic, and I was always disappointed. Like, the sermon is such a great opportunity to like move people and make them think about something, and there is never a priest that had the rhetorical skills to give a good sermon.
I consider poetry any medium that uses words in a sort of different way to speak to people in a different way. I think poetry is a way that you can get away from using simple sentences and use more complex sentences to have, or to say something that's bigger or deeper. Poetry is, I think, a way some people speak to other people when they can't speak in the regular way.
Kind of like in-between medium, in the sense of it always kind of wants to be a form of expression that it is not, that it cannot be, but that impulse is very important to it.
I would say there's definitely a difference in the way you interpret a poem, like based on the medium that it's delivered to you through. Like if you're at a poetry reading and you're hearing the words spoken aloud, you're gonna interpret that very differently than if you're just like reading it in a book.
I love reading my poetry a lot. Actually, when I'm writing, I'm always thinking, about what it sounds like. I read it out loud a lot, and I read a novel and I wrote it like that. Like, I didn't write anything unless I liked the way it sounded.
I think people do that with music all the time, but I don't know, poetry and music are kind of different to me in some ways, but then they're kind of the same at the same time. And then movies, I don't think to like the general audience they would be able to get the deep message as they would if the poetry was spoken to them. So, I mean, I feel like poetry can be translated to a different medium, but I hope that it doesn't, because I feel like it has a bigger effect when it's just spoken to. Yeah.
Even for those writers who do not want to think about, say, technology or social media or networks or digitality or anything like that at all of it is totally affected by it.
There's just not really rules, and if someone does try to make a rule, then someone else comes along and like immediately just like flips it on its head. And like there are poems that like don't even have to be your own words. You can literally like just take from a whole bunch of other sources. So I think that makes it very unique. I also think that poetry is usually like more concise, not necessarily like shorter, but like each phrase has a lot more power than in prose or in like other mediums. So I think that it has a greater capacity to like connect with people, and that's something that I think is really cool.
Yeah, so that's kind of how I do it. It's kind of like doing a playlist, but you're also know that you're gonna perform it. So.
Yeah.
Niccolo Machiavelli, Mario Andretti, a 4-course commentary. I'll be mostly what is said.
Because even avalanches break under pressure, and the first time you told me to calm down, I cracked open, fell 300 feet, and destroyed everything in range. I'm an Aries.
Do as much business as one that eats continually, and men hired to mend harnesses must be kept busy mending harnesses.
The strain of the internalized knows my name, and the failing of a morning sun calls photosynthesis into question. Have you ever seen a daisy bleed? Exactly.
Poetry focuses on the nature of language rather than on narrative, etc., etc.
That's a good definition.
I know, it was better in class. You should have been there.
No, that was good.
No, it was much more dramatic.